Think forward. Think Research Channel.
The opinions expressed in the following program are strictly those of the speaker. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation.
From the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin. This is Frontier. Discussions of today's most exciting research subjects by distinguished scientists and engineers working at the frontiers of knowledge.
I'm going to speak to you today a bit about some work I've been doing for some years involving the question, why do research organizations vary in their capacity to have major breakthroughs in science? Over the years, I've focused not only on basic science, but also I've written several books in the area of technology. My work has always been comparative over time as well as cross-national. And in this particular presentation, I will talk, if that's not too inappropriate, on major discoveries in basic biomedical science. Perhaps the subject would be a bit more appropriate for the National Institutes of Health, but I think you overlap a great deal in terms of your mission. While I'm speaking today primarily, however, about basic or major discoveries, let me say that, and I wish to make this very clear because I think sometimes I'm misunderstood, places that do not excel in making major discoveries, as I will define them today, nevertheless often do extremely good science. And so I don't mean to imply from those organizations that don't get singled out in my presentation today that they're not doing very distinguished science. Now, I've been primarily concerned with what I call a multi-level type of analysis, and it seems to me that increasingly in the world of science, we are working at multiple levels. The biologists, for example, are dealing with things that happen at multiple levels. And one of the great challenges of our time is to understand how things operating at one level are interacting with other levels. And this methodologically and conceptually, theoretically, this is not easy to do. So I will talk a bit about the institutional environments and how those place constraints on the behavior of research organizations, departments, institutes within research organizations, and ultimately in laboratories and individual scientists. And I will talk a bit more toward the end of my presentation about how some of these things are changing in this country. I think over the last 25 years or so, there have been some profound changes taking place at what I call the institutional environment, which is having some major impacts on our large research universities. And I want to begin by looking a bit at where the U.S. is in a historical perspective. If we look back over 200 years, it seems to me that the center of gravity, of distinguished science, has shifted periodically. If we go back to the 18th century and look forward from around 1750 to 1840, France was essentially the center of much of modern science. And then the center of gravity in around 1840 began to shift to Germany. And Germany was essentially the center or the hegemon in many scientific fields, at least down to 1920. It's quite clear now that the decline of German science had already begun to occur even before the Nazis had come to power, and this was one of the major reasons why the Germans created the Kaiser Wilhelm Association and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes as early as 1911 is kind of response to the concern that German science was beginning not to perform so well. Then by 1920 to at least 1945, the center began to shift to Britain, and certainly by many indicators, the U.S. has been the hegemon in most scientific fields since the Second World War. Now, the interesting thing is that at the moment when each of these countries, France, Germany, and Britain, was performing or at their height, we can look back retrospectively and observe that their systems were already beginning to decline to some extent in their performance. They were not aware of that at the time. And so today it seems to me that by all kinds of indicators, the American system is performing extraordinarily well. We have more academic journals, certainly if we norm them for the size of the scientific community, more papers, citation indices, major prizes, and the like. The American system, by most indicators, would appear to be performing extraordinarily well. One of my concerns, however, that some 30 or 40 years down the road, if we too begin to look back somewhat retrospectively, we will observe that some profound changes have been taking place in the institutional environment, in the structure and culture of our research organizations that I think have profound implications for the performance of fundamental science. I'm not predicting that the U.S. System will go into a decline. I think there are some serious problems. I think these problems are still perhaps reversible, but I think it's important that we be sensitive to them. Moreover, I think we should always be asking ourselves, how might we perform a bit better than we are? Let me share with you a transparency. This is sort of the historical growth of investments in science, and looking at these four indicators. Historically, the number of scientific papers has been increasing dramatically. Some would even say almost exponentially. Number of scientific journals, this is worldwide, but we see the same trend operating in most advanced industrial societies. The percentage of the workforce engaged in research and development, obviously this cannot continue to increase exponentially, or ultimately everybody, of course, would be a scientist. And of course, the percent of the GNP, if we look back over the last 70 or 80 years, devoted to research and development increased, and then it's leveled off. In some countries, of course, it declines a bit, but there are these enormous increases in investments in science. However, the interesting thing is that there is what I call the diminishing returns to scientific effort to make major breakthroughs. We have more and more investments in science. As I define major breakthroughs, however, those have remained somewhat relatively constant. You will see why that may be the case, given my definition of major breakthroughs in a few minutes. So we have more and more investments in science. Indeed, in some fields of science, almost half the papers are either cited only once or never at all. That doesn't mean that it is not useful. Certainly, writing a paper that is never cited is probably somewhat useful for the scientist, perhaps the scientist's particular environment. So there is a learning process in writing papers that are never cited and the like. But I do want to point out that we do have these increasing investments in science, And yet there is a real diminishing returns, I think, that is taking place. Now let me come back to this thing that I call institutional environments. The Germans, the French, have what I call a strong institutional environment, particularly the French, that is at the by national norms or even in terms of decision making. There's relatively strong control over personnel, strong control over scientific disciplines, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one of the reasons, in my opinion, the American system of science performed so well during the last 65, 70 years is that we have had essentially a relatively weak institutional environment. And where you have a weak institutional environment, you're also likely to have considerable diversity in organizational forms, different kinds of organizations. We have very, unlike the French, where there is a great deal of homogeneity in the structure and types of organizations. The German university system, I think, is in somewhat greater experiencing and has for some time been experiencing many more problems than the American system. They don't have as much heterogeneity in their organizational forms. And for high degrees of innovation to occur, I would argue, whether it's in technology or in science, a high degree of diversity is necessary. This is true also within organizations, departments, and also at the laboratory level. Now, on the other hand, I want to argue toward the close of this talk today that the institutional environment has become increasingly stronger in the United States. We have increasing what I call organizational isomorphism in our large research universities, and I think this does pose some serious problems in terms of the long-term performance of our system in terms of its capacity to continue to make what I will call fundamental discoveries. Now, in what is a major breakthrough? Since I'm going to talk a bit about this today. This definition is somewhat vague and abstract, but one of the things I want to emphasize is this word. It's the new way of thinking and addressing problems that scientists in diverse fields of science consider to be important. It's, again, the emphasis on much of what I have to say is on diversity. One of the things that we want to keep in mind as I speak today is this trade-off between range, science that is relevant to people in many different fields, and specificity. And so science that is highly specialized and narrow can be quite, in fact, most of our science is of that type and is very valuable. But the major breakthroughs, as they get defined in this project is emphasizing diversity. New ways of thinking about problems that speak to scientists in many different fields. And now, how do we, given the somewhat abstractness of this definition, how do we know a major breakthrough when we see one? And I must confess that I spent a couple of years thinking about that problem because I didn't want to have a definition that came only out of my own mind. I wanted the scientific community to believe that if I identified a discovery or a body of work as a major breakthrough, that the scientific community might agree with me. And so I was in a research institute in Sweden some years ago, and around October, where what I call the Nobel business heats up. And I had the good fortune of having lunch on a daily basis with a couple of members of the Swedish Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, where they make these decisions about Nobel Prizes. And so that was going on in my mind, and suddenly it occurred to me, well, one way of operationalizing what is a major breakthrough was the following. And I didn't want this to be a project just about Nobel Prizes. And so I decided that I would have a variety of indicators of major breakthroughs, but each one these would be recognitions of an important body of work. And so one is the awarding of the Copley Medal by the Royal Society of London, which has been awarded for many years, even before the 20th century. But insofar, and my project in this study deals with major discoveries in 20th century science. Insofar as these awards went to scientists in basic biomedical science, I included that the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine, Nobel Prize for Chemistry, but only insofar as it has had high relevance for basic biomedical science. A high proportion of those have been in biochemistry, but not exclusively. And then each year, the Karolinska Institute awards the Nobel Prizes, and they have committees that study all the nominations. These are not available for the last 50 years, which for my purposes are quite well, but I did have access to the Nobel archives, and whenever there were at least 10 nominations in 3 years for a body of work, that got included. And similarly at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, where they award, where there were these the equivalent nominations in chemistry with high relevance for basic biomedical science. And then each year they have a committee at both the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the Karolinska Institute. They go through all these nominations, and they have a short list. And if a work did not receive that nominations, did not receive a Nobel Prize, but happened to be on their short list, we have given these committees some credibility, and we've included them in our list of discoveries. The Nobel archives, as I indicated, have been closed to us over the last 50 years. So we also have 3 additional major ways of recognizing research: the Lasker Prize in Basic Science, the Louisa Gross Horowitz Prize, and the Crawford Prize, which is awarded by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. Now, okay, what do we do with that? So what and let me say I work with my wife, and I've had the opportunity to have a wonderful group of students and colleagues who have worked with me for many years. There have altogether been approximately 291 of these major discoveries. And what and these are essentially rare events. And so how do you go about studying rare events? And so what we did, we've engaged in in-depth case studies of each of these in 4 countries over a period of a century: Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. And we were interested in trying to understand the organizational environment, the structure and the culture of the organization, the departments, the labs, and the like. And we have worked through archives and engaged in more than 500 interviews with more than 500 scientists. Some we've interviewed as many as 10, 12 times, and to try to understand the organizational and institutional environments in which these major breakthroughs occurred. Now, having done that, however, we also recognize that many people are doing very important science, but they don't get this form of recognition. So one of the issues that concerned us was, what kinds of organizations, what kind of labs and the like are going on where this kind of, but they don't get this kind of research. So one of the things we did, we decided to sample organizations which we happen to know do very good science. So let me give you an example. University of California, Berkeley is one of the great research organizations in the world. And yet, in our population, it rarely had a major breakthrough in basic biomedical science, though Berkeley certainly would be recognized in certain fields of physics and certain areas of physical chemistry in the 20th century. I probably spent as much time studying Berkeley as any organization in this, because what we did in sampling organizations, we would take scientists who were elected members of the National Academy of Sciences, and we would study those scientists and ask, is there something about the way those labs and departments are structured in contrast to those in particular where organizations are having multiple discoveries time and time again. Now, the fact is that there are significant differences in these. And so similarly in Britain, we sampled labs and organizations where there would be, were elected members of the Royal Society, but major breakthroughs didn't occur. And so altogether, this has ended up being quite a mammoth project, and I couldn't have done this without the assistance of a large number of people. Let me say also without the assistance of the National Science Foundation. Now, let me just briefly say a little bit about the organizational environments in which, having done all of these case studies, in which when we stand back and try to develop some generalizations about the environments where they occur. First of all, they tend to have, if they have multiple major breakthroughs over time, they tend to be organizations with a moderate high degree of scientific diversity. As I indicated, Germany, for example, is one of our cases. Now, one of the great many research organizations of great distinction in Germany are the Max Planck Institutes. But in the biomedical sciences, the Max Planck Institutes, by and large, are relatively narrow in their range. There is a Max Planck Institute for genetics, a Max Planck Institute for this and that, but they're highly specialized. They do not, by and large, have a high degree of scientific diversity with them. And remember that research that is done that speaks to scientists in diverse fields, that's the kind of work that, by and large, gets recognized with these 10 indicators. So the Max Planck Institutes almost invariably are headed by a very distinguished scientist, and yet the scope is relatively narrow in contrast to those places that have major breakthroughs time and time again. The second is the type organizations in our project tend to recruit different kinds of people. The large research universities in this country, for example, where they have large numbers of departments, and within departments there is a high degree of subspecialization and the like, there is a tendency to recruit scientists who are highly specialized. But the few organizations that have these major breakthroughs time and time again, interestingly enough, have been those kinds of organizations that recruit people who internalize a great deal of scientific diversity, or else, having been recruited, if they are retained and are successful in this organization, they will be engaged in a great deal of learning, so that they end up acquiring a great deal of scientific diversity. Moreover, there is, as we study the processes going on in these organizations, there is a great deal of communication across different fields, a great deal of integration of scientists from the different fields. Now, how this happens varies greatly from organization to organization. If it's a very small organization, there may be a common lunchroom. There may be, and early on, some of these organizations began to developed journal clubs. Journal clubs are now quite common, but journal clubs which involve people from across different fields. This, in my opinion, turns out to be one of the most important characteristics. Having leaders who have a kind of vision or a sense of the direction in which science is moving or can move, have the capacity to recruit scientists who integrate a good bit of scientific diversity, and also provide a great deal of rigorous criticism at the same time within a nurturing environment. And finally, these organizations essentially if they have been successful over time in having major breakthroughs time and time again, have a high degree of flexibility and autonomy, and are only loosely connected to their larger institutional environment. Again, quite different from the French system, where organizations are highly coupled with their institutional environments, and therefore have not had the same degree of flexibility and autonomy that we have had in the U.S. On the other hand, the organizations that, by and large, don't perform so well, this is in terms of making the major breakthroughs. Again, I wish to remind you, be sensitive to this trade-off between specificity and range. The large American research universities that do extraordinarily well are highly differentiated with large numbers of departments. Some have huge departments with many subunits and the like. My own university, the University of Wisconsin, has biological scientists in at least 9 separate colleges with 9 separate deans, highly differentiated and the like. And as these organizations have become larger, particularly in terms of students and as well as number of scientists, there is in many activities a great deal of centralized decision making and a great deal of bureaucratic coordination, but a high degree, what I call hyper diversity, so that there is not a high degree of communication, even within departments across subspecialties, and great constraints in terms of different fields. One organization, for example, in the 1970s, 80s, and on into the early 1990s, that performed extraordinarily well, particularly in terms of citation indices and the like, was a very small organization in La Jolla, California, the Salk Institute. Now, this is a small organization in which people were able and did and still do interact a great deal with one another. But in some of our large research universities in America, in which there may be anywhere from 200 to 250 neuroscientists, they do not have the same degree of interaction and the like that you find in a place like the Salk. Now, what does that mean? Well, in some of the larger organizations, they do very good science, but they also tend to specialize in more specialized journals. Whereas one of the things that happens in a place like the Salk or at the Rockefeller University, many of the papers coming out of there will often be published in a journal such as Science and Nature, read by people in diverse fields of science, and I think it's perhaps that is somewhat associated with why the research in some kinds of organizations then get this kind of recognition for being relevant to fields in diverse areas of science and not in others. Well, you might crudely see something like this. So it is very important that there is a high degree of communication across scientific fields. In some of the large research universities of our time, there is great scientific diversity, and there is great cognitive distance among people in different fields. But And in some of these organizations that are highly specialized, there is not a high degree of diversity. There may be a high degree of communication in a small institute. Everyone is working in the same field and the like. But in those organizations where there is a moderate degree of diversity and there's a high degree of communication, there is greater potential for a major breakthrough to occur than, on the other hand, as the cognitive distance and diversity increases and there is less communication across fields, there is a diminishing capacity for these breakthroughs to occur. Now, these major breakthroughs are rare events, as I've suggested once before. And indeed, in a good many places where these major breakthroughs have occurred, they have taken place in a lab where the scientists, in a sense, march to a different drumbeat from the culture and the structure and the like. One may have come from a place where there was this high degree of communication. The scientists may have internalized a great deal of scientific diversity and the like. And the scientists may indeed make a major breakthrough. But the interesting thing is that we have so many of these we have a large number of these major breakthroughs that happen in an organization, but there's never another one. And then there are other organizations where they happen time and time again. Now, some of you who've read some of my work and perhaps have even heard me talk about this research from time to time know that the one organization worldwide that had more major breakthroughs than any other, according to the 10 criteria I use, is this tiny place on the Upper East Side of New York City. In fact, for several years after I started this research and became aware, when I posed this question, where are more of these taking place than the others, I used to tell my audience, if anyone can tell me in what organization there were more of these breakthroughs than any other, I will host you to a dinner of your choice in any restaurant. I never lost that bet, but now that I've given this presentation, I don't make that bet anymore. But the place is and was Rockefeller University. And this is it's larger today than it was, of course, many years ago, but even today, the Rockefeller has only 70 faculty members. There are no departments, and they've never had departments. Everything is organized around labs, and that's quite significant. And so whenever the head of a lab dies, retires, or for some reason might leave, it gives the organization the flexibility to stand back and say, okay, well, what do we do now? Last month, I had the opportunity to spend 4 days at the Rockefeller, and I often am there because it is sort of the one organization that I have felt very, it's a case to be pondered and thought about. And the interesting thing is that of those 70 labs, only about, there are at least 19 that are working in areas today that would not have been considered highly important to be working on 20 years ago. So the organization has had a high degree of flexibility to adapt and the like. The second thing is leadership. The Rockefeller has had 9 directors, presidents in its history. Until 1953, the head of the Rockefeller was called director, and after that it was the organization changed its name to Rockefeller University, and the head of the Rockefeller has been president. They've had 9. Of those 9, 7 of them are represented in my population of individuals who themselves made major breakthroughs. The 2 who did not make major breakthroughs were presidents of the National Academy of Sciences when they were elected as president. Now, what does that mean? I think one thing it suggests to me that in many of our large research universities where we have thousands of students, large numbers of departments, numerous colleges and the like, it becomes increasingly difficult, though there are some exceptions, in a larger university for the head of the president, the chancellor, or what have you, to have to implement a vision. Even deans may have 25 or 30 departments under his or her responsibility. And when it comes to making decisions about new programs, personnel, and the like, it's very difficult for, with such complexity and diversity, for the dean, the provost, vice chancellors for academic affairs, and like whatever, to be really on top of the issues. But at the Rockefeller, that's been quite different. So of these 9, as I say, 7 of them are in my population for having made major breakthroughs, and 2 were presidents of the National Academy. And of these 7 who made major breakthroughs, 5 were awarded a Nobel Prize before becoming president. Of these 9, all came from the outside. There is, with one exception, all came from the outside, and so they bring a new perspective to bear. The one exception was Torsten Wiesel, who, a Swedish scientist, a winner of a Nobel Prize, who had been at the Rockefeller for about 7 or 8 years. And at age 67, Wiesel became president in, I believe the exact date is 1993. And in my judgment, Wiesel proved to be the probably the most creative and distinguished president in the history of the Rockefeller. But by and large, these people have a good sense of where science is going. They are in touch with people in the field. The current president, Paul Nurse, a Nobel laureate who is English and came to the United States in 2001, again has a really keen sense of what's going on in the world of basic biomedical science. And the president is very much fixated on the science. Now that is, so the Rockefeller is the extreme outlier. But there are a number of other organizations that are in the population time and time again. And there are a certain number of similarities. Another organization in this country that historically has performed extraordinarily well was the California Institute of Technology, again relatively small. The Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, again relatively small. At these 3 organizations, the Rockefeller, the Caltech, and the LMB, or the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, the interesting thing is eating lunch was a very important part of the culture. That is, having some common venue whereby people were able to interact across fields, and indeed, in some cases, totally new research fields developed over the lunch table at the Athenaeum at Caltech or at the Rockefeller. Now, one of the things that, in fact, in doing this research, I've had fantasies that I would go around academic institutions and make photographs of where people eat lunch. And in some, of course, it's so crowded that there can be no real conversation. The Rockefeller and the Athenaeum, because they don't have such high degree of diversity, or in the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, the conversations are pretty serious and intense. Now, of course, at the high tables at the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, eating is also an important part of the culture, but there is a much greater diversity. So, sitting on one's right, if one were a molecular biologist or a biochemist and the like, might be someone specializing in Assyrian languages or an archaeologist, and certainly it is very exciting to sit next to such people, but it does really bring about it's rare that really brings about a real new learning experience and the like. So there are many different ways whereby this kind of common learning can take place. Again, one of the really exciting places in my research was the Basel Institute of Immunology in Basel, Switzerland. And of course, with over 300,000 basic biomedical sciences, it's really quite significant that in this one organization, never having more than 30 scientists, on 3 separate occasions, there were 3 Nobel Prizes awarded at the Basel. Now, I think it's not insignificant that they always had a common lunch, and they put on theatrical productions several times during the year. In other words, there was a good bit of social and professional interaction taking place. Now, one of the things that I think we need to be sensitive to, that there are different life cycles in the in fields of science. Early on in a new field, it's often it's easier in order to do something new and fundamental than after a field becomes more mature. And indeed, Max Planck, many years ago, observed that as fields mature, it becomes increasingly more and more difficult, more costly, and the like to make advances. So in the early stages of a field, there is often much easier to do something really rare. It's also interesting that in the scientific community, often in the early stages of a career, there is a great deal of cooperation and interaction among scientists in the community. But as the field matures, the degree of competition really increases and so the behavior and social interactions of scientists across organizations begins to change. And then after a while, in this life cycle, there to use a kind of a metaphor of a gold mine or something, the field has been mined, and then the question then is what happens. And a few organizations if they have particular types of structures, they have greater potential to move into new areas again and again. And the Rockefeller, again, is one of these very rare organizations that time and time again has been able to move into to new areas. Now, the Rockefeller, again, these are rare events. And when we look at these 10 types of indicators that I use, many people observe, well, the Rockefeller is not what it used to be. And of course, neither is any other place. But it is interesting that in the last 4 years of the 20th century, 4 of these major breakthroughs went to scientists at Rockefeller University. Gunther Blobel alone was awarded the Nobel Prize. Roderick McKinnon was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Paul Greengard, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and Robert Roeder, the Louisa Gross Horowitz Prize. And many scientists were quite shocked that he didn't share the Nobel Prize last fall with Roger Kornberg, but that's a complex story. But will it continue to perform that well? I have no idea. As I said, these are rare events, but it is interesting that it does have the kind of structure and culture that tends to be associated with the awarding of these major prizes. Now, let me say that I don't want to imply that large organizations don't perform very well. They do. But again, I think it's interesting when I study Harvard, and this is another place where I've spent a good bit of time. Often it is when a new department, a new program comes into existence, and a new field is being mined. In the middle to late 50s, Harvard developed a new department, the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. And on a worldwide scale, that department performed extraordinarily well for several years. And a number of these major discoveries took place there. But one of the things that happens is as the, and also there was another department at Harvard in evolutionary biology. After a while, however, the work begins to diffuse in other parts of the other organizations. The field begins to slow down. And the question is, again, for many of these large universities, even when they've created a new department and for a while it's very productive, what is the capacity at the organizational level to continue spawning new fields, or within a department, is there a capacity to continue spawning new departments? Today, I think most people would, or at least over the last 10 years, most people will agree that probably the two leading centers of basic biomedical science in the United States were the biology department at MIT and the basic biological sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. These have indeed been quite prominent, and yet UCSF is a fairly large organization. MIT is an organization with a considerable amount of diversity. But it's interesting that when we look back some 40 years ago, when those places, these two places, began to be transformed, they were by most observers considered to be not even quite second-rate. But there was this commitment to build strength in the basic biomedical sciences at UCSF, and to start with biochemistry. And the interesting thing is they had high standards, and they offered the position of chair of the Department of Biochemistry to 10 scientists, each quite distinguished, and everyone turned it down. And finally, one scientist, Bill Rutter, agreed to be chair only after he'd turned it down twice before. But the thing that Rutter did he recruited an associate chair, Gordon Tompkins, quite a distinguished biochemist who approached the subject quite differently from Rutter. They wanted to have a good bit of diversity within that department. They immediately changed the name from the Department of Biochemistry to the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics, and added a section of human genetics to it. And so here is a new kind of program, and they began to build alliances with microbiology and other departments. And after some while, a number of major breakthroughs took place. Bruce Alberts, who served for some years as the president of the National Academy of Sciences, spent some while a few years ago talking to me about his years at UCSF, and made the argument that for all practical purposes, at UCSF, departmental boundaries no longer count for anything. And so they did for quite some time have a high degree of communication interactions there, and how long this can persist, one again cannot predict. Similarly at MIT, MIT was so weak in the late 1950s in the biological sciences that there was great pressure within the institute to close biology down. But they took a high risk and appointed quite a creative scientist, an Italian by the name of Salvador Luria, many of you know. And Luria had been, was at the University of Illinois, and he went there. And Luria had a vision of integrated biology. And the interesting thing is that Luria helped build one of the great departments in biology in the world, but he did it through undergraduate teaching. The department was so weak that hardly any self-respecting young postdoc would go there. And so the name of the game for Luria was to make biology exciting for undergraduates. So as they got more students and the like, he could go to the dean and for more appointments. And for some years at UCSF, the norm was no one would be recruited unless that person could communicate with everyone else in the department. Well, let me shift to some of the closing comments I want to make. You remember at the beginning of my presentation today, I was talking about how these advanced industrial societies are making more and more investments in science, but with a kind of diminishing returns in terms of the capacity to make major breakthroughs, and that the number of major breakthroughs, at least in this kind of analysis, remains relatively constant. Now, as I look across countries, I see a similar process operating. As the demand increases for more financial resources devoted to scientific research, central governments become more involved in the funding of science and provide an increasing share of society's expenditures for research, thus altering the institutional environment in which scientific research is embedded. This has had several major consequences for the structure of the social system of science. First, as central governments increase the proportion of their budgets for scientific research, politicians and various government bureaucracies and bureaucrats become more involved in making decisions about how funding should be allocated across different fields of science. As a result, certain fields of science receive an increasing proportion of a society's investments in science, while other areas receive little or scant attention. Meanwhile, scientific communities engage in massive lobbying and public relations campaigns in an effort to influence the decisions of public officials. Second, as the amount of public sector money invested in science escalates, governments increase their activities in monitoring and auditing the behavior of research organizations in efforts to enhance research efficiency and effectiveness, and to prevent fraud. Research organizations, like business firms, increasingly become part of the audit society. Third, governments acquire an increasing appetite to assess the social benefits of scientific research. As a result, politicians and bureaucrats tend to express little interest in supporting knowledge for its own sake. Rather, they are supportive of research, which promises payoff here and now. Research having short-term societal benefits, rather than high-risk research, generally viewed as having uncertain societal benefits. Fourth, as central governments become more involved in the funding of science and decisions about how the money should be used, research organizations increasingly, or at least are threatened with the loss of more and more of their autonomy. One consequence of these processes is an increasing convergence in the behavior of research organizations within a society, a movement toward greater organizational isomorphism. Researchers tend to gravitate toward scientific areas where there is funding. Since diversity in types of research organizations is associated with organizational autonomy and flexibility, as well as scientific breakthroughs, an increase in the strength of the American institutional environment and the resulting greater organizational isomorphism may pose major problems for the capacity of American research organizations to continue making major breakthroughs, at least as significant as those in the past. Finally, the strengthening of the institutional environment of the American system of science is leading to an increase in what I call the commercialization of science. There is some evidence that in the short term, the increasing commercialization of the American university is contributing to more technological innovations as well as to higher levels of economic productivity and growth. clearly a robust for-profit science sector has been in the short term an important stimulus to the American economy. But for long-term sustainable increase in knowledge and technology, both public sector and for-profit sector science are necessary. Unfortunately, no one knows how to define the proper balance between the two sectors, that is, public sector and for-profit science. Moreover, we have a great deal of evidence which suggests that if public sector science is left to the market for its financing, over the longer term, it is likely to be underfunded. There is evidence that the increasing commercialization of science and bureaucratization of American research organizations is beginning to encourage a number of younger investigators from engaging in high-risk research. It is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, to predict or calculate in advance what the economic payoff is likely to be from any particular discovery, even important ones. Indeed, there has been for many years considerable debate about how advances in technology influence the agenda for fundamental and basic science. Historically, there's been a great deal of interactive and coevolution in the development of both science and technology. What is not sufficiently appreciated, in my judgment, is that for long-term economic growth, a sustainable abundance of underlying advances in fundamental or basic knowledge is necessary. Indeed, many fundamental advances in basic knowledge had consequences which were realized in the marketplace only long years later. The realization of economic rewards for fundamental discoveries is very inefficient and unpredictable. There is no way of knowing in advance which discoveries will make a significant contribution to the well-being of a society, or when the consequences might be realized. What is clear from the historical record is that high-risk research and fundamental basic research are necessary for the long-run well-being of a society. And there is no empirical evidence to suggest that the future well-being of societies will be any less dependent on fundamental discoveries and high-risk research than has been the case in the past. Institutional environments which provide strong incentives for overinvesting and consuming in the short term are likely to have an undersupply of productive assets in the longer term. And finally, in closing, let me simply suggest that as we think about research organizations where science takes place, that we be sensitive to certain kinds of trade-offs. This trade-off that I mentioned several times, emphasizing range or diversity across fields versus specificity, investing in the long term versus the short term, small versus large organizations. I think you can tell from my presentation that I am concerned that it may well be that the small research organization with a high degree of flexibility and autonomy may be a threatened species. And I'm quite concerned about this, if my judgments are correct, that these kinds of organizations are indeed still quite important. I trust that our society will make an effort to try to see that they don't disappear completely. Thank you.